Pro server at the PUE features and how we could use the PUE virtual sensors for live PUE calculations, and in addition to that, how we can then use our rack maps to make sure that at the same time as maximizing our efficiency, we're also not overheating any of our servers. So in previous videos, we've already looked at how to set up the rack maps. So today, we're just going to look at the configuration and setup of our PUE virtual sensors. So first thing you need to do is make sure that you have virtual sensor licenses for AKC Pro Server, which you can do by purchasing from sales@akcp.com. We sell license packs which allow you to unlock the virtual sensors within the server software there. So I've already got a PUE virtual sensor set up here. That's the one that you can see displayed. I'm going to remove this and we'll set up from scratch. So if we offline the PUE sensors that I already have here, we can set this up again. Okay, so to set up a PUE virtual sensor, we are going to select Create Virtual Sensor, and from our sensor type, it will be a PUE sensor. And the host this is going to be on is our AKC Pro server, which is where we've purchased already our virtual sensor licenses. So we will call this our data center PUE, and every 15 seconds we'll poll the data. And now we need to select our IT power sensors. So I've got several sensors here, which are our active power for our IT load. So this is the active power for server 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And now we need to select our non-IT power. So that's going to be our total active energy, phase 1 active power. And then next. And then this is where we can set our PUE efficiencies. So if we're 1.2 to 1.5, we are in a very efficient range. Above 1.5, we're efficient. Once you get up to 2.5, we're inefficient. And then hit finish, and that's it. Now this will automatically be set up and added here. Now we can rename them. So this one will be our IT power. And then we have our non-IT power. And then this is our total power. Now we've named those, we can begin to drag them here into the desktop. So this desktop I've already set up. I just need to drag the sensors back into here. So our data center PUE, and then we have our IT power, our non-IT power, and our total power. And then the final thing I want to add into here is our graph. So we will put in a graph of our total power. So we just go to Open Graph. and we'll also put in a graph of our non-IT power. And these will now begin graphing over a period of hours, or we can change this to days, weeks or months. We can choose the scale of the graph here. And that's it. That's basically how we set up our PUE virtual sensors here in AKC Pro Server. In order to get the rack maps, I have another video where we already cover that, where we can set up the rack maps with AKCP thermal map sensors, so you can accurately monitor the temperature inside each one of your cabinets. And then, like I said, we can begin then to tweak your data center settings, the amount of cooling and non-IT load that you're using, to get that PUE number as low as possible, while at the same time ensuring that we're not going to exceed any of the maximum temperatures for our servers. So I hope you found this video useful. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel.
Selamat siang Bapak Ibu dan rekan-rekan. Kita akan memulai rangkaian acara webinar kita. Terima kasih atas kehadirannya. Dalam kesempatan yang baik ini, kita akan membahas tema mengenai Data Center Utilization, what CRUR can help. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining our webinar series. Today we will discuss Data Center Utilization, what CRUR can help. Kegiatan ini didukung oleh APTIKNAS, Asosiasi Pengusaha Teknologi Informasi dan Komunikasi Nasional. Diadakan oleh Event Cerdas, mitra transformasi digital Anda. Didukung juga oleh media partner biskom.web.id, portal teknologi informasi, komunikasi, dan hukum. This event is supported by APTIKNAS, Indonesia ICT Business Association. Event Cerdas, your digital transformation partner. And biskom.web.id, IT and Law Portal. Webinar ini akan dimoderator oleh Fanky selaku Ketua APTIKNAS DKI Jakarta. This webinar will be moderated by Fanky as Regional Chairman of APTIKNAS Jakarta. Silakan Pak Fanky.
Baik, terima kasih Amanda. Selamat siang rekan-rekan semua. Semoga semua dalam keadaan sehat ya. Jadi kita akan masuk setelah bulan kemarin kita bahas banyak tentang data center ya. Di bulan Mei kita banyak bahas tentang data center dan juga kita ikut, bahkan ada yang di Jakarta bisa ikut eventnya ya secara secara onsite ya. Jadi datang ke satu event, di situ banyak sekali teknologi provider data center dan cloud. Nah sekarang di bulan Juni kita akan mulai pembahasan kita tentang Disaster Recovery Center. Nah sebelum masuk ke Disaster Recovery Center, saya mendapatkan kehormatan bisa mengundang salah satu senior kita di bidang data center, khususnya dari API Group of Companies. Ya, jadi API Group of Companies ini banyak sekali mengeluarkan standarisasi sertifikasi data center ya. Dan sebagian besar standarisasinya juga digunakan oleh berbagai data center di Indonesia. Nah, jadi dalam kesempatan kali ini kita akan coba bahas tentang data center utilization. Ya, bagaimana kita mengutilisasi data center. Mungkin teman-teman lebih banyak juga mendengar tentang apa yang tadi saya sempat tampilkan dalam video adalah penggunaan PUE ya, Power Usage Effectiveness. Nah, nanti bagaimana PUE dengan CRUR? Nanti kita akan coba dengarkan sharingnya dari masternya langsung. Jadi I will invite our next speaker, ya, Edward van Leent. Edward is from the API Group of Company as a chairman and CEO. Hello, Edward.
Hello, everybody. Good afternoon.
Yeah, Edward, it's good to have you here, yeah, because last month we already have session discussing many webinars, even seminar and expo related to the data center. And now this month we will entering the Disaster Recovery Center, Edward. But before we do the webinar and series of seminar in this June related to Disaster Recovery Center, we want to know your perspective related to data center utilization, because in Indonesia, I think there are so many data centers already being used, being developed, right? But sometimes we don't know how to utilize the data center. But at the same time, I think the industry always mention about the PUE And now there's a new term from you, from the API, is the computer room utilization ratio. What is that, CRUR? So, Bapak Ibu, ladies and gentlemen, we will hear about the CRUR in details in Edward's presentation. Okay, Edward, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Pak Fanky, and selamat siang to everybody. Welcome to this presentation where we're indeed going to talk about the CRUR, which is a new metric that we have developed to support the industry to drive for more sustainable data centers. So before we do that, just a quick overview of the agenda. I want to spend a little bit of time, maybe 1 or 2 slides about EPI for those of you who might not know us, although I think in Indonesia we're very well established, but just in case. We'll talk about some of the market challenges that data centers tend to have, the new computer room metric that we have put together and how that all relates to, for example, PUE, as Pak Fanky indicated, which is one of the common terms used in data centers. And then we'll point to the summary, some resources, and we'll give you some recommendations or steps that you could use to potentially implement CRUR. And then, of course, we will open the floor for any questions or suggestions that you might have. So very quickly about EPI, originally out of the UK, started in '87, and in 1999 we moved the headquarters into Singapore, which is still the global headquarters, from which we are driving through 11 offices worldwide, various partners in the countries. We are present in over 60 countries through a large partner network. So we are quite established in the data center industry already for 35 years. And that is really where the focus is. It's all about data centers for us. We talk about various services aligned with data centers. One of them being design validation, a service that we are using for customers who are embarking on data center projects to ensure that the design is meeting the requirements of the various standards that a customer might choose. We do auditing and certification for data centers, both the physical data center, but also on the data center operations, governance, and maintenance. And we are, very well known for the professional training that we have for both IT as well as for data center professionals. So let's have a look at the data center challenges. I think everybody knows that sustainability is high on the agenda for many organizations, and therefore it is also pushed onto us operating data centers. So we see the pressure coming not only from the organization itself, from the boardroom, as we say, but as well as customers who are demanding that we are operating a sustainable data center. You will see in some organizations that the regulatory requirements are pushing on them as well. You might have heard of Singapore, where new data centers have to start complying to certain numbers in order to drive, again, efficiency. And it's all coming in other countries as well. However, we know as data center facility people that it's very difficult to make those changes because we have typically heavily invested already in the infrastructure, and we cannot just turn it around or throw equipment away, etc. So it's not easy. And at the same time, of course, our customers expect the data center to run, nowadays at 100% availability. Anything less is just not acceptable anymore. So we're facing quite a lot of challenges in that sense. So when we look at, say, the sustainability and the drive for efficiency, traditionally, what we have seen that the focus was really more on the infrastructure level. Cooling, as you know, is typically one of the biggest power consumers in data centers, and that was, of course, a candidate that was attacked first. So you will see here that most of the data centers, and I'm sure if you run data centers, you've done the same. We started looking at putting up the hot and cold aisle, blanking panels, containment systems, etc., trying to maximize the cooling efficiency. And we also typically looked at implementing potentially more UPS systems that have a higher efficiency rating. At the same time, of course, when the whole drive for sustainability came into the market, there were various organizations that came up with metrics on how to actually measure it. You probably have heard of DCI and some of the other metrics that was out there. And without doubt, you have heard of PUE, the power utilization effectiveness, and that has pretty much become the winner, so to speak, when we talk about data center facility optimization. However, the bad news is that PUE, although very simplistic, is also often used and abused in various ways, because there are a variety of ways that you can fudge the numbers a little bit, by measuring it at different points, measuring it over different time periods, etc., etc. So although PUE is a very good measure, definitely something that we recommend to start with, there are some pitfalls that you need to be aware of. Now, one of the other things is, of course, that PUE is not, the magic number. Ultimately, what we need to do, of course, is looking at the overall facility and IT efficiency. So here I just give a quick example. On the left-hand side, you see a traditional data center setup where we might have 10 servers, each running at, say, 1 kilowatt, running a variety of applications. We have connected it to a UPS. We have an air conditioning infrastructure, of course. And if I would take this traditional setup, we might end up in, and what you can see in the box, of a PUE of roughly, say, 1.4, or in the Asia countries, typically higher, 1.8 or even 2 point something. Now, we all know that virtualization can greatly optimize the IT infrastructure. So the picture on the right shows you that we are going to embark and do virtualization, reducing heavily the amount of IT equipment. So now we could potentially reduce it to only 2 servers of 1 kilowatt. The bad news that you will see is that actually, while we are optimizing the IT, therefore we're actually doing a great job because the overall power consumption is reducing, we see that the PUE number is actually going opposite. So PUE is not the only number we should look at, because it could look great, but it doesn't mean that we are very efficient. PUE only indicates how efficient we have the UPS and the air conditioning infrastructure set up. But it says nothing about what is actually happening on the floor. So the question is really, right, is PUE the magic number, and is that the only thing? Does it really cover everything? Well, I'll see that there are some new metrics that came in, CUE, WUE, etc., etc. But really, if we are looking at, say, the overall data center setup, where is typically the biggest waste, and therefore where is the biggest return on investment destroyer, as we call it? And the fact is really, it's the computer room itself. We all know that because of PUE, that every kilowatt that we put on the computer room floor, there will be a multiple of kilowatts at the building site. That's where PUE came from, right? So if we have a PUE of 2, that means that if we add 1 kilowatt to the computer room floor, by right, there will be 2 kilowatt coming into the data center building. So ideally, we would love to have a PUE of 1, but it still even doesn't mean that the data center is efficient. The bad news is that computer rooms are typically over-designed and underutilized. And that is for a number of reasons. One of it is that the designers and consultants obviously would like to play safe. What we normally say in EPI, it's better to have 100 kilowatt too much than 1 kilowatt too little. So if I, as a designer, over-design your data center, you're probably not going to shout at me after 2 years saying, I'm hardly using my space. But if I designed it and there is 1 kilowatt too short, that means you can't turn on your IT system, then of course we will be in trouble. And this is what happens in the industry. A lot of people over-design. The other problem is, of course, that customers typically also don't know exactly what they need today and in the future, because business is changing, technology is changing. Some technology will create more power consumption, some will reduce the power consumption. And of course, with a lifespan of data centers typically in between the 10 to 20 years, it's very hard to predict the future. So all these things will be quite troublesome. And as I said, this has led to the oversizing, and the problem is we tend to not look back. So what we see happening in many data centers is once they have built a data center which is over-designed, when customers build the next one, very often they don't look back at their existing data center to see, is there a way where we can save money? Typically, they take the same parameters and over-design and underutilize the next building as well. And that is, of course, big trouble, because in the end, if you over-design and you underutilize, that will have a big impact on the return on investment. For enterprise data centers, that might be less painful compared to commercial data centers, who obviously need to earn everything back out of the rack that customers place in their environment. But apart from that, it has an impact on the environment as well, not only from a build perspective, because we're overusing material and equipment, but also from a daily operational expense, because that creates a lot of inefficiencies. And apart from that, it will cost extra money, because we all know that underutilized equipment is not very happy. Generators will require more maintenance, chillers will require more maintenance. So if we are not careful, we're going to make a lot of problems for ourselves, both in capital expenditure as well as operational expenditure. So we need to make sure that we make changes. Einstein said it once so fantastically by defining the word insanity. Insanity is like being totally crazy, right? And he said, you are totally crazy if you try to do the same thing over and over again and expect different results. And that is what we see in the data center. We keep over designing without looking back. So because of all that, we said, what can we do to make customers and the industry aware of that there is a metric that can help them to reduce it. And we called it the CRUR, the Computer Room Utilization Ratio. And this ratio is all aimed at, looking at the ICT equipment, the computer room itself, and the overall computer room setup, including its direct supporting facility. So when I talk about direct supporting facility, we're talking about the air conditioning equipment in the computer room, the UPSs feeding the IT equipment inside the computer room. Now be aware that CRUR is not a replacement of PUE. Okay, actually those two terms can actually work very well together. And what you see is that if you start implementing CRUR and you are improving your CRUR, you will often find that your PUE will get lower. That means better. And if you see that the CRUR is getting worse, you will find often that the PUE start rising, i.e. you will have a less efficient infrastructure. So these two metrics can actually work very well nicely together and balance out. So to show you in a picture very quickly how those terms are related to each other, as you probably know, PUE is measuring the IT load in kilowatt, and you divide it by the utility entry capacity. So it's basically kilowatt of computer room divided by kilowatt of the building. So we only measuring the efficiency of the UPS and the cooling systems. We don't address anything inside the computer room itself. So CRUR, as you see, will take care of the computer room, the cooling, as well as the UPS. So we won't be looking at generators and chillers upstairs, etc. We really relate it directly to the computer room and its supporting facility. Now, CRUR has been split in 3 different definitions, and the definition is still CRUR, but you can see there is a small denominator saying FIT or ITF. CRUR-F, that metric is purely looking at the facility equipment and the computer room. The CRUR-IT is purely looking at the efficiency around the IT setup, and the CRUR-ITF is combining those two. And I will go into more detail to show you what is contained within those 3 metrics. Now, as you know, the CRUR is a ratio, right? And ratios are typically one number divided by another number, and the CRUR is no different. So CRUR numbers are typically 0 point something, and the closer to 1, the better it is. Right? So in that sense, it actually is almost similar to PUE, where PUE is always a number of 1 point something, 2 point something, but also for PUE, the closer to 1, the better you do. Now, one of the things you need to realize is that the CRUR metric does not use weight factors. And later, when I explain to you what CRUR is, you will see that within the CRUR metric itself, there are a variety of parameters that we are measuring. And what we say here is that each of those parameters will be counted as metric 1. So we are not going to apply weight factors. So we're not going to say, for example, UPS efficiency is more important than aircon efficiency. The reason why we're not putting weight factors in is that if you do so, you need to establish one weight factor for all. And that is, of course, inappropriate because different data centers might have different setups. We also want to make sure that we don't get abuse of the number, because we all know that in this industry, we like to show how good we are. And if we put weight factors in which the customer can define, then of course they'll put the highest weight factor on where they do best and the lowest weight factor on where they are maybe not doing so well. So we treat every sub-metric within the metric itself equally. So let's have a look at CRUR-F, the facility CRUR. Within that one, we measure 5 parameters. One is what we call the SPCR, the stranded power capacity ratio, PCUR, the power capacity utilization ratio, the MPUR, which is basically mechanical versus power, the MCUR, which is mechanical capacity utilization, and the RUUR, which is rack utilization. And as you can see, we take those individual matrices, we add them together and we divide them by 5, i.e. we treat them all as 1 in terms of weight factor. And again, since this is a division, yeah, you will always come up with a 0 point something, whereby the closer to 1, the better it is. So let's have a look at the overall metrics. We will have other webinars where we will explain in more detail how this all works and how you can apply it to your data center. But here we just give you an overview. So one of the options within the metric is the SPCR, which is stranded power capacity. Now, power capacity that is stranded is basically, useless power, yeah, in normal operation. So look at the picture on the left. We see here, for example, 2 UPSs running at 50% load because we do the theoretical capacity here, 200 kilowatt and another UPS of 200 kilowatt. And the IT load is maximum 200, right? Because we want failover. So theoretically, we're building 2 data centers for 1 IT capacity, right? We have dual the capacity. That means we have a very high stranded capacity. We have 200 kilowatt of over capacity that we, in normal situations, don't use. Of course, you can do more smarter setups. In this picture on the right, you'll see, for example, a setup where we use what we call a catcher system. And in this catcher system, we also have 200 kilowatt of capacity. But the UPS capacity is now reduced to 300 kilowatt. That means that the SPCR ratio, yeah, is closer to 1. Yeah, it's just making sure that we have less stranded capacity. So this is one of the metrics that we look at. Another one is the power capacity utilization ratio. Well, obviously we all know that the IT load will have to be supported by the UPS. But if we heavily oversize the UPS, that means we basically have bought and we are running, a capacity that is not aligned with the load that we are expecting. Of course, there are sometimes good reasons for it, right? Because in the end of the day, a data center at day 1 will have potentially less capacity in the computer room than what we have at full build out. So there might be reasons where your PCUR is low when you start with your data center, but over time increases. That is a normal situation. But again, we try to maximize the UPS that we have bought for. This could have an impact on the way you design your data center again. As most of you probably know, there are scenarios where you can have UPSs that are built out of a modular capacity. So by using modular capacity type of installations, your PCUR would obviously look better compared to a maximum build out capacity of day 1. Another very important part is the MPUR, which is the mechanical versus power utilization ratio. For those of you that are science driven, we know that energy cannot be created and energy cannot be disappearing, right? So energy is always transforming. That simple law of energy basically says that if I have 1 kilowatt of IT load, it generates maximum 1 kilowatt of heat. Therefore, I only need to potentially have an air conditioner of 1 kilowatt to remove that heat. This is the theoretical scenario. However, in a computer room, we know that there is always some mixing of air. Sometimes we have imbalance in terms of heat loading per rack. And as a result, we typically tend to over-design again the kilowatt rating of the air conditioner versus the kilowatt that we expect in terms of UPS/IT power. Now, the more we over-design again, the more wastage we are creating. Hence, the MPUR is looking at how good is the relationship balance between mechanical energy and the power energy. And of course, we take redundancy into consideration. Another metric is the MCUR, the mechanical capacity utilization. This is basically looking at how much IT heat load you have in the computer room versus how much cooling capacity you have installed. again, the relationship should be theoretically 1-to-1. If you have 100 kilowatt of IT load, then you should not need more than 100 kilowatt of mechanical equipment systems installed. And when we talk about kilowatt for the mechanical systems, we're looking at the SHR, which is the sensible heat ratio capacity. So again, overcapacity, will lead to losses both at the CapEx and OpEx level. And the other metric that we look at is the RUUR. How optimized have you used your racks? Are all your racks empty? Are your racks filled up to the maximum, which will be, of course, ideal, but not always achievable, because sometimes, although we have space in the rack, we might be limited by the equipment that we can place in the rack due to power capacity of the equipment in the rack that we have designed for. So in this case, we assume that, again, the RUUR, similar as the other metrics within the computer room utilization ratio, can also help you with capacity planning, because if you know that your RUUR is far away from 1, that means you have still plenty of U capacity available in your computer room. So that is roughly what we discussed around the facility ratio for CRUR. Let's have a look at the other one, which is the IT portion of the CRUR. In that one, again, we have 5 metrics to keep it simple that we are looking at. We're looking at the data storage utilization, compute power utilization, memory, network port usage. So now you see that we're not talking about utilization of a port, but usage of the port, and I'll come to that later why that is, as well as the network bandwidth. Again, 5 metrics divided by 5. No metrics is going to be weighted, and in the end, again, closer to 1 would be the best option. Now, data storage, as we know, is one of the factors that we look at the CRUR, but this is not so easy to measure, right? Because data storage is very often very, very dynamic. But ideally, we would like to match the storage requirement with the storage available, because we all know that data storage is the price per the price per gigabyte or terabyte or petabyte is dropping over time. Today, that might not be the case because we know there's a chip shortage in the market, but over time we know that it's better to buy 1 terabyte in the future than 1 terabyte today, because prices will drop. So the DSUR can help you to see how close is my capacity to desired capacity. Now, the good news about the CRUR metric, this does not only apply to physical storage, but you can also apply to what we call storage pools. So if you are using virtualized storage, the CRUR metric can still be applied. Another portion that we look at is the compute power. Now, I think for the oldies under you, we all know that in the old days we measured, the capacity of CPUs in MIPS and flops and all that. But for the CRUR, we take it very simply. We just say that CPU has a maximum capacity, which we typically can measure, right? We can see what the utilization ratio is, similar as your task manager, for example, on your Windows machine. You can see how much CPU you currently are using. And then we say 100 is the ideal scenario. Anything less than 100, theoretically, it means that you are underutilizing the CPU capacity that you have purchased for. Now, we do realize that in some cases, you do not wish, of course, to run all the way to 100 because you want to have spare capacity. So what you will see for this particular metric, that it will not always be to 1. Similar as with storage, you know that CPU utilization is very often dynamic, even per minute. You can see it jumping up and down. So for this, we highly recommend to measure it over 7 consecutive days and then average out over those days. Similar what we do with the MEUR, the memory utilization ratio. Memory is also dynamically allocated and will fluctuate quite heavily, from day to day, hour to hour, and even minute to minute. So this one also requires you to have tools in place to measure the memory allocation over time and then, average it out over 7 consecutive days. Network port utilization, so the NPR metric within the IT environment, is the utilization of the number of ports. So we don't talk about the port utilization itself because that is related to bandwidth, we are basically looking here at how many ports do you physically have available in the computer room environment, and how many of you or how many of those have been used. I think we all know that a lot of the ports now are PoA enabled, so power over the Ethernet. That means that even if you have not plugged in any cable, the port will still use power. So if you have a large number of unutilized ports, you're basically having power capacity in the computer room that is going to waste. Some of you will not unplug the port, so to speak, in the command line interface. You can often switch them off, or what you can do at the least is put a lower line forwarding rate in place, because a port that runs at a lower capacity will automatically use less power as well. And believe it, in large data centers, that can often lead to a large power reduction if you can implement this. The last metric that we are looking at is the NBUR, which is the network bandwidth utilization ratio. So this is not measured at the building level, but this is measured at the computer room level. So if you have multiple computer room levels within your data center, we would typically measure the bandwidth utilization at the MDA, MDF level. And again, because it's very dynamic, we would look over a 7 consecutive day period and then average it out. Then we have the other metrics, the CRUR ITF. Well, that is the most simplistic one because it basically takes the facility metric plus the IT metric and you divide it by 2, again, no weight factors. And of course, the closer to 1, the better the optimized environment for IT as well as for the data center would be. So as a summary, the CRUR is really looking what we should be looking at, which is the oversizing and underutilization of the computer room, because that's where it all starts. The more optimized that environment is, the better, of course, the usage is of our money, as well as the operational expenses. CRUR, the good news is it applies to any size and any type of data center. So you could be small, you could be large, you could be enterprise, or you could be a commercial data center, and the metric can apply. In fact, it's quite interesting. I was in Malaysia this week and I spoke to a large data center operator, and they say, we're going to implement CRUR to our customers. And why they do that is that because the underutilization of their customers will increase their PUE, right? So if they have a customer that signs up for, say, 100 kilowatt, but when the customer comes to operation and they only use 20 kilowatt, that has a profound impact on the overall PUE of the whole data center. So they say we want to implement CRUR at the customer level, therefore driving them to a point that they don't oversubscribe too much, and therefore our PUE will be better under control and we have a better idea of capacity planning for the future. I thought that was a very, very good application for CRUR. So data center operator owners can have a look at the CRUR to look at ICT direct supporting facility. To be honest with you, if you are looking at the CRUR, our recommendation is to start with facility, because that is more static and that is a little bit more easier to implement than, for example, ICT level, which often requires the uses of a variety of network management and application management tools. So in the end, CRUR helps you with benchmarking, not only where you are today, but it hopefully also helps you when you start developing future data centers to make sure that they are not heavily oversized to the point where you start losing money. If you want to know more about CRUR, you can look at our website. The web address for the download is indicated on this chart. So I would highly recommend for you to download it. It is free of charge. So in that sense, you get a document that is very helpful for you, hopefully to save some money and help you towards your sustainability objectives. So what we recommend, download the document, attend the workshops. There will be 2 more that will be announced for you, where we go into more detail of the CRUR to explain how to look at it, how to look at the calculation, etc. Of course, you can look at your current system that you have in place that might already have some information that you can use to look at the CRUR. And ideally, of course, you start implementing it so that you can not only look at your capacity planning today, but also create improvement, not only for your current data center, but hopefully for your future data centers as well. And with that, I have come to the end for this short overview on CRUR, and we open the floor for any questions that you might have.
Oke, thank you, Edward. Oke, Bapak Ibu rekan-rekan silakan kalau ada yang mau bertanya secara langsung boleh atau lewat chat juga boleh ya. Jadi nanti nanti kita bisa bahas bersama langsung oleh Edward ya. Silakan Bapak Ibu rekan-rekan ada yang mau bertanya secara langsung? Bisa buka mic-nya, sebutkan namanya dari mana. Maka ada yang mau bertanya secara langsung? Siapa yang mau? Halo? Siapa yang mau bertanya secara langsung? Silakan. Oke, Edward, while we waiting ya.
Yep.
Sorry, siapa sih yang tadi ngomong? Suaranya nggak kedengeran nih. Siapa nih yang ngomong? Oke, I think I saw some question from Pak Joni ya. From Pak Joni asking about do we need a license to build the data center, big or mini data center? Do we need to have a license?
A license for what? For CRUR?
No, I mean building the data center, to have the data center.
Yeah, well, typically the only license that you really need when you build a data center is, for the architectural work. And obviously you need to have sub-licenses, for example, the PLN connections, right? You cannot turn on the electrical power unless you have a LEW sign off on the agreements. Overall, when you build a data center, there are a variety of licenses that you typically need to look at: building, standoffs, utility, and those parts. Sometimes there is also, depending on the country, you need a license for generator deployment, because obviously you're throwing noise and carbon in the air. You might need a specific license for that one, or an exemption, as it's typically called in most countries.
Yeah. I think the most important is number one, the electricity source, right?
Correct. Yeah, that's typically where you start, because obviously, especially with larger data center builds, then utility becomes typically the bottleneck, because especially in most countries now the grid is heavily overutilized, and that could pose some problems. That's why I said, for example, in Singapore now for new data centers, they cannot be more than 30 to 40 megawatt. Because otherwise we would stress the grid too much. Other countries might not have that restriction, or not that restriction yet. But of course, if you are living in a relatively remote area, like Jakarta obviously has a large power capacity, but if you would go to another area, you might have issues if you want that type of capacity to be connected, because the whole grid might not be able to supply it in those areas.
Yeah. I think that's the answer ya, Pak Joni Chandra. Cukup ya. Apa ada pertanyaan lain? Silakan, nanti bisa di chat atau mau buka suara juga boleh.
Oke, Pak Fanky, saya mau tanya juga.
Oke, go ahead, Pak King.
Hello, Mr. Edward.
Hello.
Yeah, my name is King Hausen, greeting from Indonesia.
Hi, James.
I want to asking you, what is the most important thing to be prepared to to consider us when we want to build a data center? Can you explain to us? Let's say, like we want to cook something, the ingredients that need to be prepared.
Right. Now, it's a loaded question, to be honest, because there are many things that you compare, but ultimately it all starts with the business planning. Obviously, we don't build data centers because we like to build them, but we build them because we need to build them, right? It supports a business function. So it's very important to understand what is the vision of the board of the company, to say what type of business are we in, what do we expect in growth, Is it going to be, for example, a natural growth through, expanding sales teams, etc.? Or are we a company that are going to acquire other companies? Because that would have a very big impact, of course, potentially on the IT environment that we need. We could theoretically double our company by just buying another company, right? So it starts with the business planning. Then from the business planning, obviously you start mapping it into IT technology that you need. Again, that has a big impact. Are we going to do data analytics? Yes or no? That will have an impact on what IT system and capacity you need. Are we going to do OLTP applications? Is it warehousing applications, etc.? And from there, you start mapping the applications to technology. And then from technology, then you get the last bit, which is the data center. Yeah. So it is a very complex process, also with a lot of unknowns. Because if I would ask you, what is your company going to do in 10 or 15 years time in terms of revenue and all that? Most people have no clue, of course, because it's very hard to predict the future. So that is where nowadays a lot of the data centers start looking more at a modular approach, where they can, increment the data center capacity bit by bit by bit. Some do that by modular design. Some organizations, they use commercial data center operators to basically expand the capacity in their facility, so to speak. But there are also limitations, of course, because commercial data centers have also a capacity planning that they need to take care of. So there is no top 1, 2, 3 items, so to speak, but it starts with business planning, then map it to IT, map the IT to the technology, map the technology to data center capacity and capability. And from there, you can start putting it slowly together. If you have an existing business and you have an existing data center, then typically it's a little bit more easier because you can look at your current capacity and infrastructure and start building on top of that, so to speak, in terms of requirements. And then if you have been longer in business, you typically have a bit more visibility on what the typical growth path is over time.
Oke. Ya, Fanky.
Ya, oke. Satu lagi, Pak.
Ya. Right.
Mr. Edward, I have one question again.
Sure.
Speaking of cloud, in this time, what are the benefits we build on data center instead of using the cloud nowadays?
I don't get the word quad.
What are the benefits of building our own data center instead of using the cloud nowadays? If we're speaking of the cloud.
Okay. Now, yeah, it's a question that many people start asking. When we talked about cloud a couple of years ago, we thought this was the magic solution to all our problems, and once we put it in cloud, our life will be better. But we also have seen now that cloud has limitations. Some of the organizations have seen that it's very easy to move data into the cloud, but once you start pulling it backwards, it becomes very, very costly. Right? If you look at, say, the traditional cloud providers, if you move 1 terabyte in the cloud, that is very low cost. But if you move 1 terabyte out of the cloud, then typically the pricing is very, very high. Another issue with cloud from an operational point of view is that because of it's so easy to turn on extra capacity, you need to have very good policies in place. So let me give an example, Kings. In the old days, when I want to deploy a new application, it typically meant that I need to buy a new server, new operating system, and buy a license, etc., etc. So I normally had to go to my management goes to procurement, and it would be a long cycle. You could not just turn it on within a minute. But in a environment in the cloud and virtualized environment, theoretically, I can have one server and I can, copy paste that server 10 times. And obviously what we forget sometimes as engineers, that we don't know that the cloud provider is now charging us for 10 instances instead of 1. And suddenly finance gets a bill which is 10 times higher than what it used to be last month. So those are some of the challenges that people face, apart from control issues, security risks potentially, although personally speaking, we all know that organizations like the Googles and the Microsoft and the AWS, they have an incredible large security team. So my personal view is that I think that cloud might be more secure in some cases compared to enterprises managing their own security. because often it's a shared job. Not many organizations have dedicated IT staff that is purely focusing on security only. It's typically a shared job, and therefore it becomes actually for the organization a high risk that things are not implemented or too late, etc. So personally, security I think is typically least of the concern, but costing, yeah, and having proper procedures in place to make sure that things are not overutilized again would be a larger concern in my view. And as again, potentially lock-in, because it's very easy to move things into the cloud, but it's much more costly to take it out again or move it to another cloud operator.
Yeah, that's a good insight anyway, Edward. But I think basically even the cloud is still there's cloud. You will use a data center anyway, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and in fairness, more and more data center users, but it's enterprise. You'll see they typically tend to go for more hybrid. So they keep, for example, very critical data and things that are used very often in-house, and they do the offsite storage for less critical data more into a cloud environment because it's less critical, so less dependency on there.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, Pak Kings. Enough, Pak King?
Ya, Pak. Sudah, Pak. Thank you, Pak.
Thank you, Pak. Okay, the next question I think from Pak Farid Ahmad. Okay, wait, yeah. How is the data center ready in terms of power? For example, one of Emerson or Legrand vendors does the CRA standard. I think the question relate to whether the Emerson or Legrand vendor are they doing the CRUR standard or not, Edward.
Okay, well, it's the CRUR is independent of the vendors, right? So because we're basically measuring the setup, so it is vendor agnostic, and obviously we're not measuring the individual components. So, for example, whether your UPS is whatever brand A or B, yeah, CRUR is measuring ratios from a capacity planning point of view. So we're not measuring, for example, how efficient is brand A versus brand B from a UPS perspective, for example, because that is something that you'll find in the PUE number. But we are looking at the output capacity of the UPS and how that relates, for example, to your IT load or to your mechanical infrastructure design, etc. So it's irrelevant to the vendor. And it is also not a measurement that can be applied to vendor equipment. It's applied to the overall data center design and setup.
Yeah. Okay. Cukup ya, Pak Farid ya. The next question from Pak Hendy Nuryadin. Is the CRUR also applicable to containment DC in terms of the power efficiency?
Yeah, it is. So you can segment CRUR to individual segments of a data center. So it could be modular data center, it could be traditional data center, it could be an edge data center. So you can apply it to either the total segment or sub-segment of the design.
Oke, silakan kalau ada teman-teman yang lain mau bertanya secara langsung, saya open ya. Jadi silakan buka mic-nya, sebutkan namanya dari mana, bisa bertanya langsung ke Edward. Silakan, ada yang mau bertanya secara langsung lagi? Saya lihat di chat sudah habis, sudah ada pertanyaan. Silakan, adakah yang mau bertanya secara langsung? Go ahead. Adakah yang mau bertanya secara langsung? Pak Imam Gunawan, is the CRUR already being a standard in data center certification in API?
Okay, yes, well, yes and no. When we say, is it already a standard? Obviously, standards slowly adopt. So now we see that more and more data centers start looking into it. Some have already indicated that they start applying it. There is a certification program around it. So why have we come up with a certification? Because same as with PUE, when people are measuring it themselves, sometimes there are mistakes being made, not deliberately, but sometimes it just happens. But it's also that a lot of organizations would like an independent third party to evaluate it, either because they don't have the expertise or they feel that it's just better for an external organization to review it rather than themselves.
Yeah.
For Indonesia, DCM Solusi, is working with EPI, so they can actually conduct the audit at the location of the data center. We will then, in the background, review the reporting, and then the certificate will be issued.
Oke, itu ya Pak Imam jawabannya. Silakan, ada lagi yang lain yang mau bertanya secara langsung juga boleh. Adakah yang mau bertanya secara langsung? Edward, I think the final question from me, because there are some measurement in the parameters that the CRUR, how they can get these values come from. I mean, that from the EMS or for NMS. I think you need to mention it in detail how they can get these parameter values.
Right. There are a few parameters that you need to look at. If you look at, say, for IT, you really rely on the traditional system management and network monitoring tools, right? Because you need to look at, for example, data over time, CPU usage over time, etc. That might be a little bit more complex to implement. There are so many systems and storage pools, etc. So as I said, recommended is to start with the facility. Now, the facility, there are two important measurements. One is the capacity installed. Now, that will be theoretically as simple as looking at all your equipment and look at the capacity ratings. The UPS, what is the maximum capacity rating in kilowatt? What is the sensible heat ratio of all the cooling equipment, etc. So that is one portion. And then the other portion is, of course, the actual usage as it is today, so to speak. And that one could be obtained either by measurement through what is already available on the systems. That could be measured maybe on the display. On the UPS, there will be display what the power ratings are. But more and more, of course, people have implemented the BMS or DCIM, etc. And then you could pull that data from those systems if you know what parameters to look at. So it's basically for facility, two components. A, look at the capacity ratings of all the equipment, and B, looking at the actual consumption as it is today, which very often is pulled out of the BMS type of system.
Yeah, thank you, Edward. I think that's the final question and our Q&A session. I will pass again to Amanda for the photo session before we hear your closing remark.
Oke. Bapak, Ibu, rekan-rekan sekalian, silakan aktifkan video kamera Anda, kita akan foto bersama.
Ayo, silakan buka videonya, kita foto bersama. Please open your video. Silakan teman-teman, aktifkan videonya. Udah? Anda?
1, 2, 3. Bentar. Sekali lagi. 1, 2, 3. Oke, Pak Fanky.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Edward, your closing remark, please.
Sure. Well, first of all, I hope that this webinar was helpful for you. As I said, it's a concept that I would really say have a look at the document, download it, review it. If you have any questions about details, again, Pak Fanky and his team is available in Indonesia to help you understand more about CRUR and how it can help you with your capacity planning, not only for your current data center, but also for future data centers. And we really hope that people start using it more and more to get a gainful insight on the existing data center infrastructure, as well as for hopefully future to be built infrastructure. Again, we're always here to support you. So again, Pak Fanky and Amanda, thank you very much for having us here on this webinar. And we look forward to hearing more from the team and from your customers about what they thought about CRUR and whether they feel that this could be a good addition for them to drive more sustainable data centers.
Yeah, thank you, Edward. Once again, thank you for sharing this update to us. Oke, Bapak Ibu rekan-rekan, jadi tadi sudah ada di kolom chat ya. Jadi ada 2 link. Yang pertama link adalah untuk Bapak Ibu rekan-rekan mendownload apa itu CRUR, dan itu ada dokumennya, ada di api.com, jadi bisa langsung download di sana. Kemudian yang kedua ada kontak tim kami di CIM@Cipta Mandiri atau nomor HP yang bisa dihubungi apabila tertarik untuk di-assess terkait dengan data center Bapak Ibu sekalian. Baik, saya kembalikan ke Amanda untuk closing dan menyampaikan kegiatan kita selanjutnya. Silakan Amanda.
Baik Pak Fanky. Thank you Mr. Edward for being our speaker today. Terima kasih Pak Fanky untuk menjadi moderator kami. Terima kasih para peserta yang sudah hadir pada Jumat siang ini. Nantikan webinar kami selanjutnya pada hari Selasa ya Pak?
Tanggal 7 dan tanggal 8.
Tanggal 7 dan tanggal 8 bulan Juni. Sampai ketemu di webinar kami selanjutnya. Terima kasih.
Oke, thank you all. Thank you Edward once again. Thank you. Terima kasih semua Bapak Ibu. Terima kasih semua. Sampai nanti ya.
Terima kasih.